Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. Today we're going to be talking about lipopolysaccharides. So as the title says, Lipopoly-what? Because a lot of practitioners we speak to know about LPS but don't really know much about what it actually is. So what we're going to do is really give you an overview. So we're really talking about what LPS actually is, how it's structured, why we should care about it, why we should be testing it, and how we can be testing it. So it's really just a whistle-stop tour, I guess, of LPS, because we all know that LPS is incredibly complicated. We couldn't possibly do it justice in such a short webinar. So just a brief introduction to the team. I think you know us all by now. My name's Charlotte. I'm a nutritionist and I head up KBMO here in the UK. And I've got a fab team. So we have Lynette, who works in customer services, who some of you will have come across if you're ordering regularly. Kelly, who I'm sure you've met at events. Claire, you'll have spoken to on your support calls. And Natasha, here again, is there to look after all the practitioners. And then we've got Emily, who's also on the call today. So I'm sure if we haven't seen you or met you, we will do soon. So I'm going to start with really just setting the scene about LPS. As I said, this isn't a webinar that's really going to teach you everything you could possibly need to know about LPS. This is just a starting point. So as I said before, it's what is LPS, why it's such a big deal, and why you should care about it. We have an amazing education schedule coming up over the next 12 months with some fabulous speakers. And many of those will be talking about LPS. So we've got Kat Smith coming up, who's going to be talking about it in relation to endometriosis. And obviously, LPS is all about context. So we can't talk about everything to do with LPS this morning. But like I said, this is an introduction to get you started. So I'm going to just start with a quick historical detour because the story of LPS goes way, way back. And for those of you who don't know, I was a historian in a previous life, so I always like to start with a bit of history. So in the late 1800s, researchers realised that even heat killed, that's even the right way of saying it, could cause fever in animals. And this led to the idea that bacteria must release some kind of toxin. This was something beyond live infections, and in 1892, Richard Pfeiffer coined the term endotoxin while studying the bacteria behind cholera. Soon after that, there was an Italian pathologist who managed to isolate this toxin. It was a bit of a mystery at the time, and noticed that it was heat stable, which meant that it couldn't be or wasn't a protein. Then fast forward a few more years, in the 30s, it was shown to be a combination of sugars and a lipid, which really paved the way for the term lipopolysaccharides, or LPS as we commonly know it. If you're not on mute, would you just mind muting yourself, please? Thank you. And where was I? So yeah, so it's, we call it LPS. If you fast forward again to the 50s, so 1952, a reliable method was developed to extract LPS, and this really kicked off the decades of research that we now know in chemistry, biology, immunology, microbiology, etc. And then by the 80s, we have scientists who identified lipid A as the toxic heart of the molecule. And then a little bit later, in the 90s, toll-like receptor 4 was recognised as the immune receptor that detects it. So we've got quite an interesting history here, all the way from, 1888 to the present day, where we see this huge scientific journey that LPS has travelled, and it's still really revealing these complicated layers today. So it's definitely not a simplistic piece of science, far from it. So what are LPS? I can't even say it. What are lipopolysaccharides, or LPS? Well, before we go too deeply into what matters, let's have a look at what it actually is. So it stands for lipopolysaccharides, and it's a molecule made literally of fat and sugar. So that's the lipo and the saccharide. It sits in the outer membrane of gram-negative bacteria, and it forms a tough protective layer that helps them survive. Structurally, it's made up of 3 parts. So we've got lipid A, which is the anchor that holds it in the membrane and is the part responsible for its toxic effects. There's also the core oligosaccharide, which connects that anchor to the outer sugar chain. And then the O antigen, which is a repeating sugar unit that varies from species to species. And this is why it's so useful for bacterial classification, because we've got those differing patterns. The key takeaway, though, is that lipid A is the part that gets our immune system's attention. That's where most of the toxicity and the inflammatory potential comes from. So when we talk about LPS in testing or in barrier function, we're really talking about the fragments of this molecule, mostly lipid A, crossing into the bloodstream where it doesn't belong and where it causes all of its mischief. So why is it so interesting? Well, even after more than a century of research, which we just recapped at the beginning there, scientists are still completely fascinated by LPS, and there's plenty of reasons for that. For bacteria, LPS is essential. As we said, it's part of that outer membrane of the gram-negative species. It gives them strength, it gives them stability, it offers protection from environmental stress, and without it, these bacteria just can't survive. For humans, though, LPS tells a completely different story. It's recognised by our immune system as a red flag, or what we can call a microbe-associated molecular pattern, or an MAMP. And that recognition helps train and mature our immune defences, but when the exposure is too high or regulation fails, it can tip into inflammation, or even in really extreme cases, things like sepsis. So LPS really is a double-edged sword. So it's essential for life on one side, but potentially toxic to the other. And despite these decades of research, there's still so much that we don't know about LPS. The exact structure of LPS differs from one bacterial strain to another, and this can influence how it behaves and how our immune system reacts to it. And many bacteria, so the good guys and the bad guys, still have uncharacteristically normal patterns of those structures. And that's why there is this constant interest in LPS, and it almost sits in that crossroads between survival, bacterial survival, and host health, which is pretty cool. So that's just some basics about what it is. So let's have a look at how its structure makes it so resilient and why this poses such a problem. Now, structurally, I think it's a fascinating molecule because it's both a shield and a signal. I have got a diagram coming up, so just bear with me. It sits in the outer membrane, as we've said, of gram-negative bacteria. It's anchored by that fatty glycolipid called lipid A, and that anchor forms the base, while a chain of sugars extends outward, a bit like sort of a molecular forest is probably a good way of thinking about it. But this outer layer makes the membrane asymmetric. So the inner side, which is built from the regular phospholipids, is fluid, it's flexible, while the outer part, which is packed with LPS, is rigid and more tightly ordered. But that rigidity comes from 2 things. So it's the way the fatty acid tails of lipid A pack together tightly, and also the strong electrostatic bonds between the phosphate groups on the neighbouring LPS molecules. And this is stabilised by cations like magnesium and calcium. But the result, and I think this is the important bit, is that it creates a tough, semi-rigid outer layer that protects the bacterium from physical threats and chemical threats. So things like bile salts, antibiotics, and other things floating around. So beyond being that trigger for our immune system, it's also a key part of how these bacteria survive in quite a hostile environment, which again, that's pretty cool, isn't it? Where we have that sort of shield and signal. So this diagram gives you a nice big picture view, I think. So we can see the inside of the cell is flexible, with the inner membrane handling the metabolism and transport. Between that and the outer membrane lies the periplasmic space, which you can see there running right through the middle. And that's a watery space containing a thin peptidoglycan layer. So it's a bit like the cell's scaffolding. The outer membrane is where the LPS lives. Its inner leaflet is made of phospholipids, but the outer leaflet, which is the side facing the world, is built almost entirely of LPS. Porin proteins act as gated channels, so they let in water, small molecules, and that allows to keep the larger, more harmful substances out. So it's that combination of porins plus the LPS that makes gram-negative bacteria remarkably resilient, giving them that resistance, their strength, but also what gives us the LPS challenge when the barrier or the gut barrier integrity starts to break down. On top of that, when we talk about the structure of LPS, not all bacteria look the same under the microscope, and that's because of the differences in the outer membrane. So some bacteria have got what we call a smooth phenotype. So these produce what we call S-form LPS, and again, made up of three distinct sections. So we've got the lipid A, the anchor buried in the membrane, biologically active part. We've got a core oligosaccharide, which acts as a bridge, and then we've got the O antigen, which is a long sugar chain that extends into the outside world. Some bacteria have a rough phenotype, and their LPS is missing that outer O antigen. And we often call this a shorter version of the lipopolysaccharide. But that missing section changes everything. So it affects how smooth or rough the bacterial colonies appear, how the immune system recognizes them, and also how virulent or even resistant they are. So this is your classic structure. So the zigzag lines down there are the fatty acid tails of lipid A, anchoring the molecule to the membrane. Then if you move upwards, the short core oligosaccharide forms the bridge, and then that long O antigen extends out into the environment. So you don't really need to memorize the sugar chemistry. It's not going to make you a better practitioner. I think it's interesting, but practically speaking, not so much in our clinical work. But I think it's important to be aware of this, because we often think of LPS as this abstract molecule, this abstract thing that does bad stuff in our body. So just remember those three zones. So you've got your anchor, your bridge, and your flag. And this arrangement really helps to explain both the strength, the strength of LPS as a bacteria barrier, but why it's so visible to our immune system as well. And although we often talk about the structure of LPS, in reality, there isn't just one version. There isn't one LPS. There are hundreds, well, probably way more than that even. Some bacteria tweak or replace parts of its core with extra sugar layers or capsules. This changes the way they interact with their environment and the immune system. Others, especially within some families, will look very chemically different as well. And this isn't just I suppose, a cosmetic thing. It's not just how they look. They affect how how toxic the LPS molecule is, how the immune system recognizes it, and even how bacteria are classified. And perhaps, I think, most fascinating is that a few species can also survive without any LPS. For decades, we thought this was impossible, but in lab conditions, certain actinobacters, and I can't even pronounce them, have shown that life is possible without LPS. It's rare, but it has happened in lab settings. So I suppose my point is that LPS isn't a one-size-fits-all structure. It's a flexible framework that bacteria adapt for their survival, their defense, and also their disguise. So don't just think of LPS as being this one individual thing. I know I've sort of waffled on for a few slides now, but hopefully that point has come across. And this is another diagram just showing that twist on the classic LPS design. So in most gram-bacteria, as I said, we've got this pattern where the antigen chain is attached, outwards. It's very vertical, that last diagram. And what we can see here is quite a different architectural pattern, changing how the molecule is displayed on the surface, but also how our immune system will respond to it. And I think these kind of exceptions, so for example, in the diagram here, it's Yersinia, it shows us how adaptable bacteria are. They can remodel their LPS depending on evolutionary pressures, host environment, survival needs. So, like I said, it's pretty cool, isn't it? So now we sort of know what LPS looks like, just not, or rather an appreciation of how complex it actually is. But I think the interesting part is when we discuss what happens when it crosses the gut barrier and translocates. And, when we talk about gut barrier, we're not just talking about a single wall of cells, it's a whole team. There's a lot going on here, and it's, again, incredibly complex, which makes sense. It needs to be complicated. It's a huge component of our immune system. And, everything, we're using it every day, aren't we? Every time we eat, drink, whatever we do, the gut barrier is implicated. So can I just please ask you to stay on mute if anyone's there? Sorry, it's just gets a little bit noisy. So the gut barrier. So it's a multi-layer defense system. So not, as I've said, a single wall of cells. At the top sits the lumen layer made up of our commensal microbes. They occupy space and resources. They prevent pathogens from getting a foothold. Next, we've got our mucus layer, which stops microbes from directly touching the gut lining. It's not just a physical gel, it's also active. It contains antimicrobial peptides, IgA antibodies that also help to protect us against unwanted visitors. And then finally, we've got the epithelial layer, which forms a selectively permeable gate. This allows nutrients and small molecules to pass, but keeps bacterial fragments, including LPS, on the right side of the fence. And these three layers work together to preserve the integrity of the barrier. And when any of them fail, LPS can potentially move into circulation and start triggering those immune responses, which we don't want. Now that's a very simplified version of the gut barrier, but in terms of our clinical awareness, these are the areas that we should be thinking about. So, under normal circumstances, LPS remains safely inside the gut lumen. It forms, as we know, it's part of the outer wall of those gram-negative bacteria. Now, our gut barrier, as we've discussed, it's made up of mucus, epithelial cells, we have our tight junctions, and we've got a whole immune network. It's certainly in a sort of a local sense, and that's helping keep those bacterial fragments from entering circulation. When that barrier is compromised, and that can be through chronic stress, infections, dysbiosis, certain medications, alcohol, fungal infections, bacterial infections, diets high in refined fats or high in sugars, or eating complete rubbish, those tight junctions can loosen and LPS can slip into the bloodstream. And we call this translocation, which you'll all be familiar with. Now, this doesn't cause, full-on sepsis or anything, but it does send constant danger signals to the immune system. And what we see, or the result, is the low-grade inflammatory state that underpins many of the chronic patterns we see in practice. So things like metabolic issues, skin flare-ups, fatigue, and systemic inflammation. And I'm sure, or I hope, as you're listening to this, you're starting to make those connections with your own clinical work. Now, what are the chronic patterns that you see in your clients? And do you ever think about LPS? Is that ever on your radar? And I think it's very easy to think about our digestive function as just that. You know, we think about, well, if someone's got gut issues or more systemic effect, let's run a stool test. But what does a stool test actually tell you other than highlights of what might be in the gut? You know, and some of it, you know, we have to take with a pinch of salt. But I think if we're directly thinking about the function of the gut barrier, I think this opens up the conversation and certainly encourages us to think differently about some of the conditions we're seeing in our clients and our patients. And this is really bridging I suppose, bridging the gap between the gut and everything else. So when the barrier weakens, LPS becomes the messenger that's almost shouting that something's not right. And I think when we see LPS on our gut barrier tests, which I'll come on to in a moment, that really is what it is. It's a massive, great warning alarm. You know, something isn't right. So what actually happens when LPS does slip through that barrier? Well, once in circulation, the immune system recognizes it as foreign, mainly through receptors like TLR4 on the immune cells. This recognition, it sets off a signaling cascade that tells the body there's a threat. Cytokines are released, acute phase proteins are activated, and we get this inflammation that really ramps up in response. In a full-blown infection, obviously that could lead to a fever or at the very extreme sepsis. I mean, with the work that we do, you know, that doesn't even fall in our remit. But in the lower level exposures we're talking about here, it looks very different because it's subtle, it's chronic, and it's easy to miss. And it's what we now call endotoxemia, or, you know, or perhaps metabolic endotoxemia, a quiet, persistent inflammation that contributes to things like insulin resistance, fatigue, migraines, headaches, skin issues, etc. And also many of the inflammatory presentations that we see in our clients. And I think it's very easy to label LPS as the bad guy. And I think everything I've said so far would probably make you think that. But we have to remember that LPS itself isn't the enemy, but when it ends up in the wrong place, it becomes a spark that keeps the immune system smouldering. And I think that's a really important point. You know, we can't escape, you know, bacterial invasions or the presence of gram-negative bacteria in our bodies. You know, but we're a ginormous ecosystem, but it's about keeping things in the right place. And this conversation sort of reminds me of the session we did last week or the week before rather, on the Hormone Insights test, thinking about estrogen. Estrogen's great when it's in the right place, in the right levels, and it's behaving itself. I think we could probably say the same for LPS. So let's have a look at endotoxemia. And this is before we move on to thinking about how we test for LPS. So it really describes what happens when small amounts of LPS enter the bloodstream through a compromised gut barrier. And this is what we're picking up on the gut barrier panel by KBMO. Endotoxemia is chronic. It's low-grade version of endotoxemia that is strongly linked to metabolic disorders. This is metabolic endotoxemia in particular. So obesity, type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Actually, it's changed its name now. It's not NAFLD anymore, is it? MASLD. And it's often used interchangeably with endotoxemia. I mean, they are quite distinctly different. One has more of a metabolic angle and one is more sort of non-specific endotoxemia. So they are used interchangeably, but they are distinct. So endotoxemia, it's not sepsis, it's not extreme, it's not, you know, a terrible fever or something, But as we said before, it's subtle. So it's a chronic leak of bacterial fragments that keeps the immune system slightly switched on. And we now see associations between a wide range of conditions, from metabolic syndrome and cardiovascular disease to cognitive issues and neurodegeneration and skin inflammation. But it's important to remember that not every rise in LPS is pathological. Even in healthy people, levels can temporarily rise. We sometimes see this after fatty meals, and then they'll fall again without any consequence. But the difference is persistence. So ongoing barrier stress, dysbiosis, immune dysregulation can turn these short-term fluctuations into a chronic low-grade inflammation. And that's really the hallmark of endotoxemia. It's just bubbling along. It's, if you think back to that image with the volcano, volcanoes aren't always active. They're not always flowing like this. There's just this sort of steaming and it's heating up, and it's just, what's going to happen. And I think it's a good comparison, I think, with what we're talking about. Okay, so when the intestinal or vascular barriers break down, LPS and inflammatory cytokines can enter the circulation. So we've established that. Interestingly, some act indirectly through the vagus nerve. Others can influence the brain more directly if that blood-brain barrier is compromised. So once there, these signals can activate microglia, the brain's resident immune systems, leading to, again, persistent low-level neuron inflammation. And this is really the gut-brain inflammation that we talk about, a pathway that explains why chronic endotoxemia is being researched and investigated in conditions like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and even mood disorders. And two people who do use KBMO and are, work in this area. So we've got Dr. Robert Silverman and Mark Hyman. They're both have been talking about this quite recently. So it's a big deal. And I've included this diagram. This is a quite a nice diagram. I think this is showing the two-way communication between the gut microbiota and the brain. And the dysbiosis and the barrier disruption allowing bacterial metabolites and LPS to enter circulation, which can influence immune signaling and also brain function. And communication happens through several overlapping routes. So we've got the vagus nerve, which normally senses activity in the gut wall. So if the epithelial barrier is damaged, bacterial fragments and metabolites can come into contact with vagal endings, changing the nerve signaling. And if any of you have listened to some of Dr. Christy Hughes' presentations around the vagus nerve and how she's used the FIT test and worked with conditions like COVID and other chronic issues, she talks a lot about this. Secondly, we've got circulating metabolites. So that would include endotoxins and short-chain fatty acids. And these, in some cases, can induce inflammation. They can maintain or disrupt the blood-brain barrier and also affect brain function. We've also got systemic inflammation. So cytokines and other immune messengers released in the gut can travel through the bloodstream and trigger those issues in the brain, the microglial activation in the brain. And then we've got immune receptor signaling, especially TLR4, which we've talked about, which detects bacterial components like LPS and shapes immune tolerance or inflammation. It really drives how we react to those components. Under normal conditions, these pathways support communication and homeostasis, keeping everything nice and steady. But when dysbiosis or barrier breakdown occur, the same routes become, conduits for inflammation. So that's linking gut health directly to brain health. But it's this combination of those four areas with the vagus nerve, circulating metabolites, systemic inflammation, and then the immune receptor signaling processes. So I think it's safe to say we're still piecing together the mechanisms, but when the gut barrier leaks, the brain will eventually hear about it. And that's a big deal, isn't it? You know, that's not just someone with gut issues or a bit of constipation, a bit of diarrhea. We have to think about what's happening beyond the gut. And unfortunately, a stool test alone won't tell you that. So this image really brings together everything we've covered. So what happens when LPS crosses the gut barrier and enters circulation? So we know that once it's in the bloodstream, it's not going to stay local. It's traveling through the body. It's triggering immune receptors like TLR4 on many different cells, not just immune cells. So, for example, the liver, LPS activates Kupffer cells and drives inflammation along the gut-liver axis. That can potentially raise liver enzymes and contribute to conditions like fatty liver and insulin resistance. And this is really when we talked about metabolic endotoxemia. In the brain, we've talked about this. So inflammatory signals, sometimes LPS itself, can affect the blood-brain barrier and activate those processes. And that what we see is a linking of gut permeability to mood changes and at worst neurodegenerative processes. The cardiovascular system, so low-grade chronic endotoxemia can promote endothelial dysfunction, low-level vascular inflammation, and these things are both stepping stones towards atherosclerosis. In our fat tissue, our adipose tissue, LPS interacts with macrophages. It fuels metabolic inflammation and weight relation issues, again reflective of metabolic endotoxemia. And then in our joints and skin, LPS can amplify those existing inflammatory pathways. And that might show up as flare-ups or pain or rashes in sensitive individuals. But I think the key message here is that LPS acts as a systemic amplifier. So even low-level exposure is nudging the immune system into a chronic, smouldering inflammatory state. So again, think about the volcano. And that's why understanding barrier integrity and spotting the patterns of low-grade endotoxemia is so clinically powerful, which in turn tells you that testing the gut barrier can really significantly change your practice, how you work with your clients, how you can understand their issues, but also lead you to better outcomes. And when we get better outcomes, more people book to come and see us. So I suppose this is really sort of summarising what we've talked about, but I just need an excuse to put that brilliant diagram in, because I just think that's such a nice summary of showing, the differences. And I think it's almost looking at the big picture, or I suppose this is our so what moment. When clients talk about leaky gut, what they're really describing is the increased intestinal permeability. So in other words, a barrier that's become too porous. I know it's very simplistic and I suppose oversimplistic, but that permeability doesn't just let nutrients and water pass. So that's normal. It needs to be that highway, doesn't it, of things changing. But it also allows LPS, undigested food antigens, toxins, etc., to move into circulation. And our immune system is going to react to those molecules, producing low-grade inflammation that we've said underlies so many of the chronic issues that we see in our work. And that could be everything from bloating, fatigue, skin issues, weight gain, brain fog, the great long list that we have. So when we talk about endotoxemia, we're not just talking about it in this abstract academic sense. It's one of the mechanistic links between barrier dysfunction and whole body symptoms that we practitioners see every single day. And understanding this connection, I suppose it reframes leaky gut from this vague idea that influencers talk about on social media into something that is measurable, it's explainable, and it's physiologically grounded. And I think that's exactly where the FIT test or the gut barrier panel comes in. Oh, now my mouse has run out of charge. I can't change my slides. Hang on. Okay, panic over. So testing the gut barrier. So if you're not familiar with the KBMO tests, the gut barrier panel can be ordered as a standalone test or as part of the FIT 176, which is a food sensitivity panel that tests for 176 foods. I use the FIT 176, which includes the gut barrier panel, with every single client that I work with. If they won't do it, we don't work together. It's that simple. But looking at what we're testing, the gut barrier panel acknowledges that leaky gut occurs across a spectrum, and it includes those gatekeeper markers, Candida, zonulin, occludin, and LPS. For each marker, we measure IgG 1 to 4, C3d complement, and IgA 1 to 2. And if we have a look at those individual parts in a bit more detail, this helps us to understand what's happening at the gut barrier and how they connect to what we've just discussed. So Candida, it's a yeast. You all know this. It normally lives harmlessly in the gut and on mucosal surfaces, but when it overgrows, the immune system can recognize it as a problem. So when we see elevated IgG to Candida, it's not always an infection, but it's a sign of immune activation against fungal overgrowth. I mean, it sort of sounds like I'm saying the same thing, but it's quite a subtle difference. So when we see Candida on gut barrier, we don't automatically reach for the antifungals. We have to look at the Candida in the context of what else is going on for that client and what the other markers are doing. But it often sits alongside symptoms such as dysbiosis or, we've talked about increased intestinal permeability reflected by, say, zonulin or occludin. And we may see symptoms like bloating, brain fog, fatigue. I mean, there's a great long list, isn't there? I mean, you could pretty much link everything to Candida, couldn't you? But I think we have to now look at Candida slightly differently, certainly differently to when I first qualified. I mean, when I started, we were spitting in little tubes and measuring Candida, and every client had Candida, and every client went on an anti-Candida diet and bought those awful cookbooks, and then fell off the wagon in 2 weeks, and then didn't come back. I joke about it, but it was very much like that. Whereas now things are much more sophisticated. We can look at Candida in context. It's not always the bad guy. Then we have zonulin. This is a protein that regulates the tight junctions between the cells of the intestinal wall. When zonulin levels are raised, it's telling us that those junctions are opening too widely. In other words, the gut barrier is compromised. And this is one of the best known indicators of leaky gut. Occludin is one of the key structural proteins that make up the tight junctions themselves. And if we detect antibodies to occludin, it suggests the immune system is reacting to the gut lining. So it's indicating damage or exposure of those structural proteins. And again, another strong clue that the barrier is compromised. And then LPS. So as we've already discussed, systemic LPS has been shown to play a major role in multiple disorders, way, way, way beyond the gut. So taken together, if we're looking at elevated Candida, higher zonulin, occludin antibodies, or LPS reactivity, they're all telling the same story. And I think when you look at your gut barrier panel and some of it doesn't make sense, you have to piece it together in the context of your client. And I think this is where our support calls can really help you. And Claire knows everything there is possibly to know about all this stuff. So she's a great person to speak to and learn from. So zonulin, now I've picked out zonulin, partly because it's the marker that we all recognise, we all know. When we go to, we joke about it, when we go to conferences and events, we have all of our lovely materials, our handouts, but everyone always runs over shouting, "Zonulin, you test zonulin." I think it has, as I've said, it has to be looked at in the context of everything else, but it does draw a lot of attention. And we measure zonulin using ELISA assay, and the KBMO version uses serum or blood spot. Now, you can only use blood spot in the UK, Europe. Serum's only available in the US. So this is the same sample type used in Fasano's original research, which lends strong credibility to the method. And what's unique here is that the FIT panel measures antibodies to zonulin, not the zonulin protein itself. And zonulin protein is normally what is measured in stool. So we do not measure protein, we measure antibody. Measuring protein is problematic. It's very difficult to measure accurately in stool. And I think this distinction is really important because we're not just looking at whether zonulin is present, we're looking at whether the immune system is reacting. And antibody detection can therefore give a much more stable and meaningful picture of barrier stress than stool zonulin, which is highly variable, which, when it's measured in other assays, it's not always that accurate. So Fasano, who first developed or discovered zonulin, his team partnered with the KBMO, and alongside Dr. Brent Dorval, who created the FIT test, worked together to create the zonulin aspect of our panel. Now, Dr. Brent is quite a big deal because he developed the first rapid HIV diagnostic test. So I suppose what I could say is that our testing is built on strong research. The methodology is robust, it's clinically validated, and it's designed as a whole to reflect how barrier dysfunction presents in real practice. And I think this quote from Fasano beautifully sums up the core message of our talk. He's adapted the classic Hippocratic idea to reflect what we now know, that all disease begins in the leaky gut. So Fasano's work, as we've said, identified zonulin, which is the protein that regulates those tight junctions between the intestinal cells. And when zonulin is overproduced, those junctions can open up and the gut becomes more permeable, i.e. leaky. And I think a leaking bucket is the perfect metaphor because when the barrier fails, things that should stay contained, i.e. bacterial fragments, and then we've come full circle back to LPS and food antigens, they start spilling over into circulation, which can create inflammation and immune activation throughout our body, not just in the digestive tract. So when we talk about intestinal permeability and gut barrier function, I think we're really standing on the right shoulders of Fasano's research. So I couldn't really mention the gut barrier without bringing in the FIT test. So the food inflammation test is the food sensitivities report. And the gut barrier panel brings the food sensitivity part of the test to life. It really is the why. And it gives you, the gut barrier gives you that information in relation to the gut barrier, but the food sensitivity aspect is what's happening for your client. And it gives you guidance on how you can change their diet and support them overall while you're working on their gut barrier. The food sensitivity testing is a multiple pathway approach measuring the adaptive pathway, which is antibodies and exposure, as well as the alternative pathway, which measures inflammation via complement and C3D. The multiple pathway approach, which you see on the right-hand side of this diagram, allows us to zero in on the key foods that are causing a problem. And this could typically be 4 or 5 up to maybe 10 or 15 at the worst. We don't see lists and lists of food sensitivities that you see on other food sensitivity tests. So this enables us, this technology allows us to eliminate the false positives that we typically see with IgG only testing. And as a side note, KBMO does not test food intolerances. We test sensitivity. And that's a really important distinction to make because it's a case of the immune system versus enzymes. We're not looking at how enzymes are working in your body and whether you have them or you don't have them. For example, lactose intolerance. We're looking at food sensitivities and the inflammation that those food sensitivities may cause. And if you're familiar with our tests, this won't be new to you. This is an example of a report. It's easy to read, it's color-coded, it's client-friendly. It's easy to interpret. It's it helps you be more efficient in your practice, and it's very easy to repeat the tests. It's easy to see the changes. It's easy to monitor and measure those changes. Sorry, just having a bit of a mouse problem. It's just not working. Sorry, just bear with me a second. So I've got a couple of people who've just arrived. I'm trying to let them in, but it's not very easy when you don't have a mouse that works. Right, so I think I've done that slide. Sorry about that slight distraction. So I suppose my point really is that yes, you can do the gut barrier alone. If you can do the food sensitivities at the same time and it applies to your practice, then great. If you can, it just gives you a much more rounded view of what's happening. And if you're a nutritionist, nutritional therapist, this information is gold. And it's not like the old IgG tests. And I think I've already alluded to that, because we're not just measuring IgG on its own. IgG alone is unreliable. You're more likely to get false positives and a really long list of foods. And we're not in the business of telling our clients to stop eating foods. We want them to eat more foods, but the right foods that suit them. And this is a great way of doing that. And when we think about the two tests together, it's also really difficult, isn't it? Which came first? Is it the food sensitivity or was it the leaky gut? Did the food sensitivity lead to the leaky gut or intestinal permeability? Or did that permeability increase the likelihood of food sensitivities? Who knows? So I think that's why it's important to look at the big picture. And doing both really brings more insight to the cases that you're working with. So testing and retesting. I think it's important to consider retesting. The gut barrier is not a fixed structure. It's responsive. It's constantly repairing, adapting. It may occasionally relapse. And all of this depends on diet, stress, medication, microbial balance, infections, etc. And I think that really does illustrate why retesting is so valuable. It allows us to confirm whether the changes we've made, so nutrition, lifestyle, if it's appropriate medications or supplements, are they genuinely improving the barrier integrity? A single shot test is only going to give you a snapshot, and a repeat test allows you to see a trend or allows you to monitor the changes. So if markers like zonulin, occludin, or LPS antibodies normalize or reduce, that's evidence that you're doing something right. If they remain elevated, well, there's still something there that's driving permeability, and that's a signal to look deeper. And that may be beyond the remit of your practice as well. So you need to think about all the things that could be, I suppose, prodding that integrity. I think retesting is also highly motivating for clients. Seeing those objectives shift on paper helps them understand that their efforts are changing their physiology, not just their symptoms. So the gut barrier itself, as a standalone test, is £100. But if you want to retest a client who has done a Fit 176 or a gut barrier, you can order a retest for £75. So it's a 25% discount if you want to do the retest. And if you don't know when to retest, I think, it can vary. Some people might be 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. but certainly within that 12-month period, you should be considering retesting, and doing just the gut barrier is a really good option, I think, and certainly an affordable option. So as always, we have our little special offer for you. If you haven't tried the Fit 176, including the gut barrier panel, and you would like to, instead of the usual price of £300, it's £180 following this webinar. And it's a great opportunity for you to experience the test firsthand, explore the results, but most importantly, see how it can transform your practice in how you can communicate with your clients, but also how the test and working around the markers can lead to really good or better clinical outcomes. So thank you very much for this morning. I was desperately trying to keep that between 45 and 50 minutes. I'm not quite sure whether I've made it, but almost. But hopefully now you've just got a nice overview of what LPS is, why you should care, why it's so important, and why you should test. And as I said, as we have other speakers coming in over the next few months, there'll be more of the what you can do with the results, because what you do with those results is dependent on your client, context, and their history, and also the particular symptoms and conditions you may be dealing with. If you do have any questions, there's our email address, our web link, and you can also follow us on Instagram. I will stay for any questions if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask. And thank you very much for listening. So if you do have any questions, we'll have a look at those. So let's have a look. Right, so Iman, I have a client, his blood test, his stool test shows dysbiosis and his gut barrier shows LPS negative, while IgG 1-4 but positive for IgA. So all of the leaky gut marks are negative. I think if you've got an actual set of results, we do our clinical conversations where you can drop in and we can go through your tests and your results. If you haven't had a support call, it might be worth getting in touch with Claire and she can talk through that. But it's much easier to talk through results when you've actually got them in front of you. You can see all the things on there. Just because a stool test shows dysbiosis, it doesn't mean that the gut barrier is also going to be positive for various things. A lot of this has to do with context as well. Sorry, I'm not sure that's all that helpful. I often see patients with positive zonulin, but negative genetics for gluten sensitivity and negative blood markers for celiac, and even FIT comes negative for wheat, rye, etc. So if they're celiac and they're not eating wheat and rye, it's less likely to show up on the test. And also markers for celiac. Yeah, I mean, I think you can have elevated zonulin, independent of celiac or non-celiac gluten sensitivity or any of those things. There's, as we said, there are so many things that are prodding our immune system and affecting the health of our gut and the integrity of our tight junctions as well. Stress is a huge one. Medications, lifestyle, diet, so many different things going on there. Julia, I do Fit 176 every single client. Excellent, 10 out of 10. So Julia, the retest, as we said, is £75 for the gut barrier. I think Emily's answered that. Is there a need to redo the FIT test, or is it better to redo the gut barrier test? I think it depends. I know it's really frustrating because it seems every question in nutrition, the answer is it depends, isn't it? Well, I certainly feel like I say it depends the whole time. So usually with my clients, if their gut barrier is significantly compromised and they have huge loads and loads of food sensitivities, I think it's probably worth doing the whole test again. However, if it's just a few foods on there, even if their gut barrier is compromised, probably just the gut barrier. But I think it depends on the context and what else is going on for them. So looking at Candida in context, well, I think, what else is going on for them? Thinking about their symptoms and the diet that they eat. I think it's just we shouldn't just look at a gut barrier and go, oh, Candida, let's do a whole anti-Candida protocol. I just think that it's more nuanced than that. And I think, what I would do is we have got a presentation that Helen Edwards from New Roots did for us on Candida, which is really good. And it might be worth contacting Helen to have a chat with her about Candida, because she's brilliant. She just does loads around Candida. So yes, the recording will be made available. Yes, the slides will be shared. There isn't a discount for retest because it's already discounted. So it's normally £100 and we're selling the retest for £75. So you can't order that on our website. You can only order that if you email the office, because you have to quote the client or patient's original ID form from their original test so that we can monitor that it's a retest. Otherwise, everyone's going to go online and buy a discounted retest. So we have to be able to link up the reports. So just send us an email. So UK office at kbmodiagnostics.com. Does the food sensitivity change as well when the gut barrier gets better? Well, we'd hope so, yes. We do tend to see positive changes in the food sensitivities and the reactivity based on the improvements we make to the gut barrier. Now, the gut barrier takes a really long time to break down, and guess what? It can take a really long time to put things back together. So I always say to manage your expectations. If you have someone who's got a severely compromised gut barrier, as shown by the gut barrier panel, it's probably not worth testing too soon or retesting too soon. I'll just give it a bit more time. Excellent. Any other questions before we go?
Charlotte, just thought I'd jump in here while we were talking about Candida, just to let everybody know that at the end of November, we'll be having a whole webinar on Candida with Layla Elmuden, and some more information about that will come out soon.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thanks. I knew we had something coming up, but I didn't want to say it in case I got the day wrong. But it's something that we've revisited regularly. I'm sure we can dig out the older sessions for you, but I think it's always best, I think, to have the newer, more update webinars on subjects as well. If you do have any questions, I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes. Otherwise, I know we've hit 11 o'clock, so if you have to go, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And I hope you're feeling a little bit more enlightened about LPS, and hopefully a little less scared about it, because practitioners completely freak out when they see LPS. But, I think this just shows that there's a lot of potential to support your clients through diet and lifestyle, medical support where it's appropriate. And, we'll do our best to keep supporting you in terms of what you can do about the results. I know today was very much about, what is LPS, or, Lipopoly-what, as the title of the presentation said.